Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it is the second of my conversations with Luke Kemp, author of Goliath's Curse, as part of our series about the fate of humanity. We are discussing societal collapse. Today, we are bringing the story into the modern age. What makes modern Goliaths different from the states that existed before them? Does democracy make a difference? And are these states more or less vulnerable to falling apart? Luke, I want to ask you about something we discussed last time and see if we can pin it down a bit more for my own benefit, apart from anything else. You described a pattern of human social development in the period after humans had settled down. So let's call it post the agricultural revolution, which is sometimes called, in which you see a kind of wave effect or a sequence that repeats itself. Human beings settle, population grows, settlements grow, buildings get bigger, hierarchies are established, domination takes effect, some of it pretty brutal. We talked last time about human sacrifice. That's about as brutal as you can get. Not all of it in that form, but nonetheless, there's a wave of growth and then it goes into retreat. There's a kind of dissolution. Population shrinks, populations scatter, buildings are pulled down, elites are pulled down, and then it repeats itself. So it's growth, I guess we could call it decline without any moral or other connotations related to that, and then growth again. So one of my questions is, this may for some people have a faint echo of what is a very different account of how human societies have developed over time, but also fallen into patterns, which is what is called Malthusian views of population. The idea that there is a limit to how far and how fast human societies can grow in population terms, and they always reach a barrier, a buffer, and it's often quite brutal. The food runs out, disease, misery, as Malthus called it. Now, Malthusianism still has one or two defenders in the 21st century, but it's also, I think, been discredited in most of the ways that a theory can be discredited. But I'm interested just to be clear about how the account you give is different from that, because it is clearly different from that. But when you think about these early societies, and this is a story that runs through to much more recent times in certain parts of the world, reaching their limits and going into a kind of retreat or going back to an earlier phase in which human populations are more distributed, authority is pulled down, there is a leveling effect. What are those limits? What is the buffer that these societies are hitting?
First of all, as a slight caveat, while we always use the term agricultural revolution, it's worthwhile noting that while it was revolutionary in its consequences, it wasn't in its pace. The agricultural intensification process took thousands and thousands of years. Even when you just look at fields in Southwest Asia, so kind of modern-day Near East, it often took roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years for just the share of barley to double in a given area. Hence, this was a very long, drawn-out, staccato, stop-and-go process. How does this differentiate itself from the Malthusian process, which is essentially population can increase geometrically? You have a multiplication over generations, but the increase in food production is essentially arithmetic. It's much slower than the growth in population, and so hence over time population tends to outstrip food production, leading to this boom-bust cycle. And as you mentioned, that boom-bust cycle is something we see in different places in the world, from Europe through to the southwest of the United States. There's a few reasons why Malthusian dynamics don't explain what we're seeing here. One is that population size and density doesn't always correlate very well to these boom-bust effects. Again, the much more marked, clear, consistent indicator is growing wealth inequality beforehand. Another is that there's many cases where we can see that there isn't a population decline when you see the other effects of collapse occurring. So there's definitely population decline in some of the cases we've discussed, like the first times of Europe. But in others, say for instance, when we look at the collapse of the first city-states and empires of the Near East or China, There often wasn't a large-scale population decline. Instead, what you see is more political decentralization and fragmentation. Hence, that doesn't really fit the Malthusian story either. And last but not least, when we look across the grand sweep of history, we often do see numerous different empires and polities that seem to go for a prolonged period of time and have consistent growth in both population and economically without going through a Malthusian boom-bust cycle. So Malthus at this stage has been pretty thoroughly defeated. There's some explanatory value there for some cases, but it's really not a good overall theory for the grand sweep of history. What we're describing here is more capture and fracture. You have different hierarchical, dominance-based societies that over time are getting better at capturing larger groups of people, holding them together for a prolonged period of time, and then usually breaking apart once again. A good example of this is Sargon of Akkad, 2200 BC roughly. Sargon was a marcher king. Essentially, he'd march from city to city, conquering as he went, and installing a puppet dictator or governor in his wake. Sargon's often recognized as the world's very first emperor. The problem that Sargon faced is one that essentially all of these different polities have faced is, as you grow, how do you keep control of a larger and larger population? In Sargon, it was through the delegation of authority, as many other polities had done, but this was really difficult if you didn't have things like either horses, for instance, to more quickly convey communications and commands across a large territory, or if you didn't have things like writing in order to record ideas, laws, tribute, taxation, etc. One of the key things that seems to hold back the earliest Goliaths, these earliest forms of dominance-based society, is how well they had technologies of control. So things like writing, for instance. And there's some interesting emerging studies suggesting that this provides more or less a cap on the size and growth of early empires and states. In short, those that didn't master the art of administration, who didn't have things like writing and large-scale bureaucracy, tended to stay smaller and be more unstable.
And just to be clear, where was Sargon? Where was this happening?
This was in essentially modern-day Iraq, so in Mesopotamia.
So the account that you've just given there, the buffer that gets hit, is essentially scale or size in the absence of certain technologies or techniques, we might call them. And you can see how there might be a pattern here in which you accumulate more land, more territory, more people. You run up against the difficulty of controlling such large areas. And in the end, you almost build the conditions for your own destruction, which is you've got to delegate, you've got to trust, you've got to create other little hierarchies within your hierarchy. In a way, it's a classic political story. You can divide and rule, but you can also be destroyed by dividing your own authority. Sometimes in the more morality tale versions of these kinds of histories, this is characterized as a kind of hubris, sort of Ozymandias style, in which there's almost a natural human tendency to go beyond the limits of what you can sustainably manage. So you are an emperor, an early emperor, you've acquired power, you're getting your status recognized, things are going pretty well for you, but you can't stop yourself. You need more territory, you need more people. And eventually you go too far and the thing falls in on itself, it implodes. But as you also said, often these things happen for external reasons. There is a climactic shift or there is a natural event that causes it. Do you think there is any truth to the hubris story? I think when it is told as a hubris story, it is often to want to tell a morality tale about our times now, and we're going to come on to that. But do you think there's any truth to it, that this tells us something about the kinds of human beings that rise to the top of these kinds of structures, which is they literally don't know when to stop?
There is a kernel of truth to this. We discussed earlier how over time there has been a selection effect in dominance hierarchies to select for people who tend to both want status much more, are willing to dominate others to get it, and in turn, usually people who are higher in the dark triad as well. One thing we didn't mention last time is there's also an emerging literature in both neuroscience and social psychology of corruption by power, that people who get higher in a hierarchy tend to have a number of knock-on effects in terms of their psychology and even their neurochemistry. They tend to be more likely to both cheat on their spouses and in games. they tend to have less risk aversion, and they tend to overvalue and overestimate their own abilities relative to others. So even when you had relatively good people get to the top of these hierarchies, there's a good chance they will become more corrupted by power over time. But we don't need to turn to hubris to understand why empires and states over time have tended to want to expand. And as you mentioned, this is a pretty almost universal phenomena. When we look at different Mongol empires, they usually had this idea of universal conquest, that was the end goal of the empire, was continuous universal conquest. Similarly, caliphates had the idea of expanding the Ummah, that essentially this was a moral imperative to expand the religious community. And even Rome had an idea of, kind of similar to the United States today, that its expansion was good for the world because it was usually just bringing liberty, civilization, and the rule of law to those around it. While there's ideological explanations for why you often saw constant expansion, another more simple one is that if you want status, you have to continuously get more energy and more resources for ever greater acts of conspicuous consumption. And on top of that, if you have a whole bunch of different competing elites who you have to pacify and keep happy at home, it makes sense to once again get more resources in order to placate them. And the best way to do that historically has been through conquest and through warfare. That's because economic growth otherwise usually wasn't very large, so you had to rely more on force of arms. And this in large part explains why when you look across history, most states, the biggest item by far on their budget was military expenditure. Whether it's Rome, the Song dynasty in China, or even early modern Britain, they usually spent somewhere between 3/4 to 4/5 of their budget on the military.
So given as you describe, it's not simply hubris. There's a deeper dynamic at work here, which is the drive to display status is almost inevitably going to lead to moments of overexpansion because there is no limit to it. I mean, it is one of the things we know in our world. Very wealthy people still want to be wealthier because they notice they haven't quite opened up that gap between themselves and everyone else, and you end up with the world that we live in now. There is one particular version of that kind of morality tale that gets told a lot. So it was popularized by Jared Diamond in particular. And I think a lot of people have this story in the backs of their minds when they think about the ways in which human societies maybe have a tendency, always, almost inevitably, to overdo the conspicuous consumption to the point where they become destructive of their own ability to survive. And that is the story in the West, still known as Easter Island. The native name is Rapa Nui. And the Jared Diamond version of that is taken as a warning to us that this is what human societies do. So this is one of the ways in which they collapse. They get caught up, in the case of Easter Island, building these giant statues, cutting down the trees to build the giant heads, and they destroyed the natural habitat. And as he said, what was the thinking of the person who chopped down the last tree? Jared Diamond's account. Human beings lose their minds, effectively, and they certainly lose any sense of long-term stability because of the short-term effects of status competition. But that, you think, is also not quite right. So I'm trying to get, between these versions, you've got the Malthusian version on the one hand, which is this is just a natural effect. On the other hand, you've got this particular morality tale, the Rapa Nui Easter Island tale, which is, watch out, this is what human societies do. They always go too far because human beings can't rein in that desire to have the bigger head, the bigger statue. What actually happened in Rapa Nui?
So the Easter Island, as you say, Rapa Nui, which is the more appropriate term for the people, is usually told as a tale of ecocide and overshoot. So they overshot their environment and then collapsed thereafter. In particular, the idea is that the Rapa Nui both engaged in deforestation and also imported the palm rat, which basically eats the seeds of the palm tree and hence leads to deforestation long term as well. That deforestation in turn caused soil erosion. Soil erosion led to agricultural collapse, and agricultural collapse, of course, eventually culminated in famine, warfare, and even cannibalism. Now, that's a typical tale told by Jared Diamond and others. The problem is it doesn't really have much evidence to back it up. When we look at satellite imaging of the landscape, which is a good proxy for overall food production, and when we look even at genetic analysis, so we have one genetic analysis of 15 different Rapa Nui individuals, we don't see any signs of a genetic bottleneck or a genetic population collapse prior to the arrival of Europeans in the 1860s. Throughout that period beforehand, it seems like they had a pretty stable population of 3,000 to 4,000 people. There was large-scale deforestation, but this doesn't seem to have led to a collapse in agricultural production, nor a collapse in their population. What people have often pointed to as spears being used in a civil war actually appear to be general-purpose tools, including for use of gardening. Instead, what happens in the case of the Rapa Nui is in the 1860s, Europeans arrive. They introduce a large number of unknown diseases, things like smallpox and influenza, and they also engage in slave raids. So a large amount of the population is taken from the island over to Peru, where they have to work in guano mines. In short, this is more a tale of genocide and colonization than it is of ecocide. And by the end of European arrivals, roughly 1877, the population has collapsed to roughly 111 people. This doesn't mean necessarily that the environment or environmental degradation has no role to play in collapses throughout history. Climate change is a current phenomenon where we do see multiple different societal collapses, ranging from the earliest collapses of the earliest Goliaths in North America through to numerous different states in Europe and China that often they do coincide with climatic change, interestingly, usually cooling. But importantly, it's not a knockdown argument. We have multiple different situations and states who've experienced similar levels of cooling and did not collapse. Environmental degradation, similarly, sometimes happens in some collapse situations and sometimes appears to play no role whatsoever. It's worthwhile noting that even in the case of environmental degradation, it's once again, usually, as you mentioned, driven in part by status competition. If once again you need to placate elites at home and expand your own status, you need more resources. And one of the best ways to get them, other than conquest, is of course to extract more and more from your local environment.
So just to be clear, the Easter Island story, the symbol of it is an island which ends up with effectively no people, but the giant statues left behind. This is the Ozymandian tale in a way, and it features in literature. It's there in Samuel Butler's Erewhon, a kind of the idea that there are human societies that leave behind as their relics the symbols of their own overexpansion and hubris. And in the East Island case, it is the haunting site of those statues. The idea being that somehow the people who lived there were so preoccupied with the making of these essentially redundant objects that they lost sight of the destruction that they were wreaking on their natural habitat. And as you say, this is not irrelevant to the story, but this is not the driver of this story.
Precisely. And while the Moai are a very fetching, captivating, and eerie symbol of, this once powerful society, at the end of the day, it doesn't really mean much if you built big monuments, and it doesn't really say that this was down to environmental causes. The Olmecs of Central America also built giant stone heads, in this case usually built from basalt. But as far as we can tell, their collapse had nothing to do with the environment either. It was largely about internal revolution and equality, most likely. The monuments, while catching and become a symbol of collapse in many ways, they don't really tell us much about the causes per se.
The Rapa Nui Easter Island story then gets us to the heart of what I want to talk about in this episode, because now we have essentially the clash of two very different versions of what you call Goliaths, states, large hierarchical structures. We have the European version by the time we're in the 18th, 19th century. These are states of the kind that we would recognize now. So in our conversation so far, we've been talking about and calling things states that I think, frankly, were we to live under them, we wouldn't really experience them as the kinds of states that we're familiar with, not least because of their fragility, as you described. But at some point in this story, that tale that you described of early expansion, settling, hierarchy, and then dispersion and collapse, let's call it collapse before it repeats again, shifts to a different register. We start to get much more stable and much more powerful versions of these things. It's not just a modern story. We've already alluded to some of the very powerful and relatively stable versions of these things. Rome is one example of that, a very long-lasting Goliath. But it did collapse. It did end with Rome as a version of Rapa Nui. The city of Rome left its monuments behind. There they were, haunting tributes to the hubris of the people who'd lived there, but the population completely disappeared. A city that had 1 million people in it by the early Middle Ages had tens of thousands, if that. Grass was growing in the places where Romans had gathered in their hundreds of thousands. This was a relic of a past, but it had been a very powerful and incredibly powerful and relatively, in terms of the story that you described at the beginning, where the average length of life of these things is a couple of hundred years, a relatively stable, dominant hierarchy. So Rome is sort of somewhere between the two bits of the story that we're talking about here. It's much more stable and more powerful than some of these earlier versions, but it did also collapse, and it is less stable, or it was less stable and less powerful than some of the things that were going to come after it. So I just wanted to get a sense from you of that overarching story through this early cycle of building up and then collapsing of these entities, these little Goliaths, let's call them, through to the bigger ones that nonetheless collapsed, and then through to the ones that are still around today. Some of these states are the states that we live in, and they are the most powerful organizations that our world has ever seen. So where does Rome, say, fit in the arc of that story? Is Rome more like 21st century United States, or is it more like some Paleolithic early city-state?
Rome is a midway point, and it is a midway point in a process of competition and evolution. Before we get into that process, it's worthwhile taking a quick step back and defining our key terms. So thus far, I've been using the term Goliath, which I use to refer to a group of interconnected dominance hierarchies, one of which is the state, what Thomas Hobbes would call Leviathan. The state is a set of centralized institutions which impose rules on and extract resources from a given population. Now, the Roman Goliath wasn't just the Empire of Rome. It was also all the different hierarchies which underpinned that. So the differentiation between master and slave, men and women, rich and poor. So that's an important differentiation. The other is empire. And I think this is where I have a bit of a hot take when it comes to Rome, is that Rome was always an empire. And to me, indeed, controversially, I'll say, all states are ultimately empires.
All of them? Going all the way back?
Yep, all of them. I would say going all the way back to the very first state of Namur. So empires are usually defined as a political entity based upon one group dominating and assimilating others. And this could be through formal conquest and then demanding tribute from them, or it could be through the informal control of resources from others. Egypt, under Namur, the very first state, was a unification through conquest of the north and south. It's an empire. Likewise, while we like to draw these lines between Rome as a republic versus Rome as an empire, as a republic, Rome expanded almost 4,000-fold, actually over 4,000-fold, through conquest. If that's not an empire, I'm not sure what is. And similarly, we often had these big debates over, was Great Britain an empire before colonization? It did, of course, involve Norman conquest of England, followed by Wales, and then eventually the Irish as well. We often tie ourselves in knots trying to define when something is an empire, when it's not, etc., because ultimately the unsettling truth is that all states are empires. They're almost always one group, a core, extracting resources from, using violence, another larger group. And that even goes down to hierarchical hunter-gatherers, like the Calusa, for instance, who were a group of hunter-gatherers who relied upon fish in modern-day Florida. They were there when the Europeans arrived and actually expelled the Spanish for a short period of time, who also dominated a large number of corn-growing neighboring villages. They too, in many ways, in a very basic sense, through having a core which demanded tribute from others, were an empire. But if we want to just make it easier, we can think of empires as when one state conquers another state. That's when you get an empire. The difference to me is one of degree rather than a really clear dividing line per per se. What unites all these different things, empires, Goliath, state, to me, is all of them a part of a criminal enterprise. When the story we've described thus far of Goliath fuel, lootable resources, monopolizable weapons, etc., is essentially one of organized crime, of one group developing a hierarchical, regulated, extractive monopoly on a previously unregulated market, which is the definition of organized crime. So, in many ways, history as we know it is a story of organized crime. What happens from there is the rackets get better and better at controlling larger amounts of territory. So you start with Bronze Age weapons and no horses, but eventually you end up with horses and iron weapons, which means you can start to craft bigger empires. Alongside that, you get big improvements in governance. So Rome, for instance, had a bureaucracy that's actually larger than the European Commission, over 35,000 people strong. It had a statewide census, not a particularly effective one, but nonetheless, still fairly exceptional for its time. Hence, Rome we can see as a point along this trajectory of empires growing ever bigger and using new technology and governance structures to both maintain greater stability, but also to extract more resources from their citizens. To put this into a bigger picture, from the very first state, so Narmer, roughly 3100 BCE, through to classical Greece, 600 BCE, the largest empire was roughly 1.3 million square kilometers in size, which is just slightly bigger than modern-day Egypt, which is roughly 1 million square kilometers. After that, within about 1,000 years, you get Rome. You also get the Han Dynasty in China, which are roughly 5 to 6 million square kilometers. So substantially bigger, with a much greater administrative command over their citizens. After that, you eventually get the Mongol Empire, which is roughly 24 million square kilometers, but only lasts for a couple of decades. Before colonization, Rome is pretty exceptional, as is the Han Dynasty in China. They're particularly remarkably long-lived empires. And Rome in particular is really unique because after Rome, no empire holds all of Europe in its grasp once more. Rome lasts for centuries. The closest we get afterwards is the French Republic or French Empire under Napoleon, which manages to take over Europe but only holds it for less than a decade. So Rome is a pinnacle of this evolutionary process for Goliath.
One of the implications of what you say is the thing that people fixate on, as you just alluded to, the shift from the Republic to the Empire, is really window dressing. It's one version of a criminal organization changing its modus operandi and clearly becoming more centralized in some respects. That is, it becomes the rule of a single emperor, but also it's still distributed in lots of other respects. And it requires buying people off, bribing them, sending people out into the provinces with promises of enrichment, and then having a pretty ruthless ability to pull down the ones who get too big for their boots, all of that. And that's there in the story of the Republic, it's there in the story of the Empire. So the thing that historians and indeed political philosophers spend their time obsessing about, the difference between one version of Roman rule, which seems to have in it some idea of freedom, and the other one, which is oppression. Insofar as that's true at all, it's only true for a very small elite group of people whose lives definitely were different in the Republic relative to the Empire. But that was the criminal gang. So it's like caring about the fate of the criminal gang. The criminal gang were indeed freer in the Republic than they were in the Empire when they were subject to the whim of one man. But for the 99%, as you called them last time, it makes almost no difference. So that is a very different telling of that story. I'm then interested in the question of why the Roman story nonetheless ends in a way that is familiar from earlier stories, which is with collapse. It is with total collapse. I mean, the thing completely falls apart. Clearly in the West, not in the East. The Roman Empire in the East persists, and then you get something called the Holy Roman Empire, but as famously it was said, it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, though on your account, it is an empire because everything is an empire. But the Chinese story, these two vast empires that coexisted 2,000 and a bit more and a bit less years ago, and they were of roughly similar size. They both had censuses, and the censuses came up with numbers that weren't that dissimilar, 50, 60, 70 million people at various points. Why does the Roman story end so differently from the Chinese story?
In some ways, Rome and the Han Dynasty are quite similar in how they end. They even have a similar timeline in which they fall apart. And they both appear to have very similar reasons as to the demise. So one we already touched upon is overexpansion. Rome, from the initial city of Rome, expands over 5,000-fold to the highest extent of its empire. As they conquer further afield, they get less and less, and the costs of maintaining the military, but also the number of enemies they created, pile up. So it's what many people call imperial overexpansion, and the Han Dynasty, to a large extent, suffered from the same thing. So this is one story we touched upon, but another one we spoke more about in the previous podcast was that of inequality, and this is the other really key aspect to it all. In both Rome and in the Han Dynasty, you see rising wealth inequality over time. And this appears to be particularly corrosive to society. So we know from modern day studies, both looking at states within the US, but also different countries across the OECD, that high levels of wealth inequality tend to be correlated with a whole bunch of social ills, ranging from social political violence through to even higher environmental pollution. But on top of that, there are other knock-on effects. Wealth inequality has a pretty strong empirical relationship to corruption, to polarization in the modern world, to democratic backsliding. And it also has this phenomena which some people quite academically call structural demographic theory. In short, as you get a more unequal society, you get a larger number of elites competing for a small, limited number of high-status positions like a throne. As you get that burgeoning, glutting elite class, it tends to make the price of things go up. That leads to what in today's language you'd call a cost of living crisis, and what in the past we refer to as popular immiseration. People can't afford as much stuff, and their things like health tend to decline as well as even their height. A combination of both a disenfranchised public and a larger number of elites looking for power tends to be a powder keg for having coups, rebellions, and civil wars. And you see this both in the context of the Han Dynasty and in Rome, where you have periods of turmoil and strife where the state starts to fracture even before the full-blown collapse. So in the case of Rome, this is known as the Third Century Crisis, where you have essentially emperor after emperor, coup after coup, within a century-long period. All of those knock-on effects I refer to as diminishing returns on extraction. As you get more inequality and you get more centralization of power, it slowly hollows out the state until eventually it's knocked us under by usually a combination of different threats. In the case of Rome, both climatic change, disease, pandemics, and also invaders from the north. In the case of the Han, it's basically horse-based steppe invaders, disease once again, and potentially climatic change as well. The big difference is China displays much greater continuity across empires. When Rome falls apart, you end up with a competing chessboard of kingdoms for hundreds of years thereafter. As mentioned, Rome is the only empire which manages to hold all of Europe in its grasp for a prolonged period of time. That's not true of China. In China, you tend to have pretty long-lived empires, and even when they fall apart, there's great continuity, both in terms of the bureaucracy, the administrative class, the language, and the extent of empire doesn't usually diminish greatly from the Qin, roughly 2,000 years ago. This is for several reasons. One is geography. Europe is basically much more broken up with mountain ranges in particular. A second is China, as mentioned, just has far greater continuity in language and administrative class. They had a much bigger emphasis upon bureaucracy. And last but not least is China had much greater exposure to the steppe. So geographically, China was prey for steppe-based nomadic invaders. And indeed, you actually have a couple of times in Chinese history where basically the steppe-based invaders take over and establish their own dynasty for a period of time. This usually meant that people were more afraid. The last darker angel of that nature that we haven't spoken about is that when people are threatened, they tend to become more authoritarian in their values. It's what I call the authoritarian impulse. And this has been held up in a very large number of different studies from across different fields. People who are afraid tend to create a fertile ground for building authoritarian regimes. And that's why, in large part, China has been particularly authoritarian, but also has been a hotbed for particularly long-lived Goliaths and regimes. So that's the biggest difference. In Chinese history, we very rarely talk about full-blown societal collapse. We talk about the warring states period, etc. In the case of Europe, we're usually quite happy to talk about collapse.
And the simplest illustration of that is you are comparing the fate of the Roman Empire with a dynasty. And dynasties come and go, and they can come and go within a structure which has, as you said, continuity. We're going to come back to the case of China later on, but I now want to focus on Europe, and I want to get your sense of what you think is either qualitatively or quantitatively different about the states, the Goliaths, the Leviathans, that started to emerge in the modern era. Now, we could argue about when we want to date that modern era, but let's say from the 16th, 17th century on, we get the emergence of states with familiar characteristics, hierarchy, domination, bureaucracy. They tax what they can loot, in your version. These are criminal enterprises. They monopolize violence in the famous Weberian definition. They tend to be very geographically constrained. They're starting to have very clearly defined boundaries and borders. It takes a while for these to be properly defined. They're pretty loose to start with. But these states that begin to emerge and then take a form that we would recognize today, so the British state, as we would call it in the 17th century, the other European states that start to emerge in France, 17th, and then after the Revolution in the 18th century, are they different from what came before? And if so, how? Because this is very important for the question of whether they're going to collapse or not. I mean, this is what this whole set of conversations is about. We want to know how much we are at risk of collapse and what that means. But first of all, we need to know, are these states categorically different kinds of enterprises?
They are different in several important regards. They are still, of course, states. They still fulfill the basic function of extracting resources from citizens and imposing rules upon them. And as mentioned, they still tended to have a preoccupation with warfare. Charles Tilly very famously said that the state makes war and war makes the state. And interestingly, he was looking mainly just at the formation of kingdoms in the context of Europe. For me, this is actually a longer-term tale. So there are still some very important similarities and continuities here. The differences, the two big ones, are both democracy, but also the governance and the depth of these regimes. So first of all, it's still the democracy component. Europe was quite different to China and even the Near East in several important regards. One was that they often had democratic practices prior to the arrival of states, or much more deep, at-scale democratic practices. So, for instance, both the Germanic tribes to the north, but also people across Scandinavia practice things like the Altings, basically large-scale popular assemblies, and these seem to in some way persist into states. And indeed, this seems to have had some impact in the evolution and development of the parliamentary system within the UK. So there's a longer democratic tradition here, which ends up influencing the state. A second important factor here is after Rome, you have much more competition, but also much more innovation within Europe. Scholars have often argued a lot over why Europe ends up economically and militarily overtaking the rest of the world, what we call the Great Divergence. And explanations vary from better musket powder and gunpowder-based weaponry, sea and ocean-faring ships, Enlightenment values, coal, and many other things. Underpinning all of this was fragmentation. After Rome, you had this competing chessboard of different kingdoms all vying for status and power, but connected through a common culture of Christianity. And all of them had very strong incentives to innovate, particularly in military. And so hence you have really rapid innovations, both in things like gunpowder, the development of cannons, the development of the compass and ocean-faring ships, but also in their governance structures as well. You get the development of joint stock companies, foreign exchanges, centralized banks, usually in order to provide greater depth for the military. But all of these provide also greater resources for the state. And so you end up with regimes that start to have police forces. Much further along, you end up with intelligence agencies as well. But you also end up with states that are far better resourced and usually provide more public goods to their citizens. So that combination of state capacity and slightly more democracy, slightly more inclusive arrangements, means that you get this trajectory where states start to provide more public goods and start acting more in the benefit of the citizens. As you've alluded to, we tend to project Denmark across history when we think of the state. We tend to think of states as primarily providers of public goods like security, stability, education, etc. Historically, they've been more predatory regimes rather than being like Denmark. It's in Europe during this period you start to see the first foundations for a different type of state.
And there are two sides to that. So on the one hand, I'm getting from what you say the democracy story, which is that in some respects, these new states owe some of their stability to the fact that they are less obviously criminal enterprises. Or at least if they are criminal enterprises, they are much better at concealing it and at distributing the benefits of the enterprise itself. But alongside that goes the fact that these states acquire what we tend to think of as empires. So you have expanded the meaning of the term empire to encompass basically all forms of political hierarchy, because they're all extractive at origin and they all involve the forcible assimilation of people. But the empires that were acquired by these dynamic European powers, some of them tiny, the Dutch Republic, but through its dynamism, one of the inventions that you didn't mention there, the stock exchange, which originates in the Dutch Republic, which allows for investment to scale on these overseas enterprises. And that allows for the creation of empires that are the kinds that we tend to think of when we use the word empire, which is overseas dominions. Highly extractive and frankly also criminal. So it's actually the story here less that internally these states got better at relating their operations to the well-being of their citizens and more that they simply exported the criminal activity.
Essentially all of the above. So it's worthwhile first of all noting that while some regimes within Europe were more inclusive, like the Dutch and like the English, many, like in Spain and Portugal, were still largely just hereditary monarchies. And additionally, while there was improvement in some regards, in general these were still by and large predatory regimes. And as you mentioned, one really important factor here is that all these different innovations, so the development of joint stock exchanges, centralized banks, and the combination of the private sector with the public. So it's worthwhile remembering that most big colonial enterprises, including the Dutch East India Company, the Royal African Company, these were all private endeavors. Even, for instance, the conquistadors, so Hernan Cortez, when he arrives in Mesoamerica and encounters the Aztecs, he is technically acting as a private expeditionary force, with some degree of government support and legitimation, but largely, more or less, as a startup. As you mentioned, the key here is that colonization provides a new infusion of resources into the European core. This leads to unprecedentedly large empires. So these empires, first of all, have one big difference. They're maritime. They cross oceans, and that's something that had not happened prior to European colonization. The second is they reach incredible new size. The British Empire is, as we all know, an empire which the sun never sets. It crosses multiple different time zones. It is also the largest empire formerly to have existed in history. It reaches 34 million square kilometers. So it's larger than the Mongol Empire, larger than anything that came before. It also lasts longer than the Mongol Empire, in large part because it has new technology. Things like the telegraph. And there's even some very revealing statements from British colonial officials who talk about how the telegraph saved the day when it came to suppressing rebellions in India, for instance. That combination of new governance structures, a new political economy of empire, one based upon the extraction of resources from overseas colonies using things like cash crops and slave man plantations, as well as changes in technology and governance at home, do create, in a way, the next evolutionary step in empire.
In the story that you've been telling, that we've been describing to this point, scale always comes with big risks. And the risk is essentially overexpansion. You are overstretched, and the phrase imperial overstretch gets used a lot. It gets used a lot in the 20th century, it gets used a lot in the 21st century. And overstretch is one of, it's not the only one, and it's not sufficient, but it may be necessary to these repeated patterns of collapse. Are there aspects to these vast new Goliaths that you think made them, or maybe still make them, somewhat more impervious to that kind of overstretch? So it is true that the British Empire, in the form it existed at its peak, no longer exists. And indeed, it is no longer in that sense an empire. There is something called the Commonwealth. You can interpret what that means in 100 different ways, but we are not in the age which we would have been if we were having this conversation 100 years ago. We would have been talking about an absolutely recognizable, bona fide, vast imperial operation. So you could say that the British Empire has ceased, but it didn't collapse in the way that we are talking about with the end of Rome, in the sense that it was unwound, and it was unwound with some moments of extreme violence, Indian partition. All sorts of things happened, which to experience them was to experience the worst kinds of failure of human social organization. But nonetheless, the end of the British Empire is not like the end of the Roman Empire. Are there features to these enterprises that make them, if not more stable, then at least more resistant to that imploding kind of collapse?
So, touching upon the definition of collapse once again, it's a contraction and fragmentation of multiple different power structures. What we see happen in the case of Portugal, Spain, Great Britain is imperial contraction, not full-blown collapse. The elite class doesn't totally fragment, for instance. Economically, the core is not greatly impoverished. Many of the power systems still stay in place. Indeed, some scholars claim that what really happens is you go from having direct formal control of overseas colonies to instead having more subtle control through extractive economic arrangements, what some people would call neo-colonialism. But in short, this is a very different phenomenon. It's contraction, not collapse. Why is that? A couple of different reasons. One is that the heightened pace of innovation just simply makes collapse much more difficult to do. These states have just much better both abilities to control their citizens. They have things like modern-day police forces, which are, bear in mind, quite recent. Most empires throughout history did not have a police force. They have much larger administrations, but they also have far greater technological prowess, which create larger and larger surpluses, so they don't have to rely so much upon either environmental degradation nor upon conquest. They still do to a large extent, worthwhile reminding ourselves that even the US has a large number of overseas territorial assets, including places like Puerto Rico, and of course we still have large-scale environmental degradation today. But nonetheless, innovation does provide a point of difference here. And the second is that the sheer infusion of resources into the core just simply made it difficult to cause a societal collapse. So during this period of colonization, you do of course see some regimes rise and fall in their prominence. Spain gives way to the Dutch and to the UK, for instance. But there's no full-blown societal collapse in Europe during this period. So the key big differences here are resources, the transfer of resources from overseas colonies into the core, a far greater control domestically, both through governance and new technologies, and last but not least, innovation, which is what caused the changes in both governance and in technology, both in terms of telecommunications, but also in terms of weapons.
So I want to ask you about someone we talked about last time, but in this context rather than that context. So in some ways, the villain of your story is Thomas Hobbes, in the sense that he is the justifier, maybe even the propagandist of domination and hierarchy, because on your account, he has a false view of deep human history. He misunderstands the natural condition of humankind. He calls it a war of all against all, as you very persuasively described. The evidence that we have available to us now shows that it is much more often the default is something which is more fluid, but also much less violent than that. And the possibility of this omnidirectional conflict that Hobbes seemed to assume would exist in the absence of a dominant hierarchy. The evidence simply isn't there. I accept all of that. But Hobbes is also, in some ways, the philosopher not of dominance and hierarchy per se, but of the modern state. The Leviathan is a very distinctive thing. These things that pre-existed, including Rome, he loathed everything about Rome, Roman politics, the Roman Empire. He loathed the ancient world. He had contempt for the ways that human beings had previously tried to organize their hierarchies, because he thought that they were inherently unstable, prone to factionalism, likely to collapse in corruption and infighting. And the victims of that would be ordinary people. Ordinary people, and you've said this, it can be terrible to live through one of these collapses, partly because you may be at the mercy of multiple criminal gangs trying to clean up the spoils. And Hobbes lived during a period not of societal collapse as such, but of something like the worst that can happen in a human community, which was the 30 Years' War, a war that really was omnidirectional. It drew in religion and clan and dynasty and economics, town, city, countryside. People found themselves fighting about everything, and communities were destroyed. So in that context, it's understandable why someone might want to look for a different kind of stability. But I would read Hobbes as not just saying, this is what human beings are naturally like, and so we need this kind of structure to stop us killing each other. I read him also as saying, this is who we have become. We are now creatures living in this world, which includes industry and commerce. It includes luxury, as he called it, the possibility, which wouldn't have been available to most human beings, of a certain kind of commodious life, a comfortable life, a long-lived life, one of the things that he thought might be possible under certain kinds of regimes. And also, I think it's one of the things that people forget about Hobbes. When he describes the quote-unquote state of nature, he says one of the things it lacks is the security to plan for the future. That we are now the kinds of creatures in the modern world where we want to leave things to our children. We want to build maybe businesses or structures that will have a life beyond ours. And that is not possible under conditions not just of anarchy and chaos, but probably also pre-modern fluidity and openness, where people can come and go, move in and out of political arrangements. We need something that's stable. And the way to achieve that, he thought, was to create a version of these Goliaths that was relatively impersonal in the sense that its power did not derive from the people who happened to hold the power at any given time, but an underlying understanding that you need these kinds of structures. And there seems to me there are two things about that that aren't quite captured by seeing him as the philosopher of dominance and hierarchy. One of which is people like us, we are not hunter-gatherers, but nor are we even people living 2,000 years ago. Our expectation horizon has changed. And under those conditions, we are likely to be amenable to the offer of a certain kind of stability, which may include democratic legitimacy. That's the first thing to say. And the second thing to say is that the thing that we needed rescuing from was the thing that caused all of these previous Goliaths to collapse, which is they were too much captured by specific human beings. And actually, the Leviathan is a machine. The point of it is not a Goliath. A Goliath is a very big human being. A Leviathan is a robot on Hobbes's account. It is a machine that operates according to principles and practices that are essentially mechanical, or even in his version, algebraic. It's an arithmetical political system. And there are many things wrong with Hobbes's account, but the idea that for people like us, what we need rescuing from is all of these previous collapses, which happened because power ended up being identifiable with specific human beings, those greedy men, those status-hungry young men, that family, that tribe. They expanded massively, but in the end, the Roman emperor was the Roman emperor at any given time. In the Leviathan, Hobbes says, it doesn't matter who rules. It doesn't matter who rules as long as what you have is a state that functions. And it is at least possible that the states we live in now do have that kind of stability built into them. It may not last. Politics is becoming repersonalized in all sorts of ways, including in the democracies. We see it. One of the things that we notice about our politics is that it's becoming the province of families and people and little elites scratching each other's backs. But the promise of the Hobbesian state is to rescue us from the conditions of collapse caused by the fact that in the end, all power is personal. I've got that off my chest. What do you want? What do you want to say?
There's areas we converge here and areas where we diverge. First of all, in terms of the divergence, I would say that people, even under conditions of anarchy, and it's worthwhile, when we say anarchy, we're referring to a state of no rulers. That's what the initial Greek term means, not a state of chaos. Even in conditions of anarchy, like in the Paleolithic, when you had these fluid civilizations, people were capable of long-term planning and of having longer-term stability as well. So, for instance, where I come from in Australia, the Indigenous Australians, the Aborigines, have things like shell middens. So basically, as groups go through different coastal areas, they'll leave piles of what they've eaten in order to signal to others, here's how much I've taken, and here's how much you should take. That's a form of long-term planning for sustainability, essentially. And similarly, if you're going to take a hunt from certain choke points and follow migratory species, you have to have some degree of long-term planning and understanding. And across all of this, we just have that culturally, there's a continuous political culture and material culture for most of these communities. So, for instance, the Khoisan people of the Kalahari Desert appear to have pretty continuous mythology and material culture for potentially over 100,000 years. So there's definitely an ability to have stability, to pass on culture, ideas, and even materials across generations. Hobbes, I don't want to be too hard on. He did the best he could for his time. He didn't have access to anthropology or archaeology, for instance. He more or less had to draw up a list of psychological assumptions and then project it outwards. And as you said, for his time, his conclusions are completely reasonable. If you live through a civil war and you're constantly moving between different states due to political upheaval, it's understandable you have a pretty grim view of things. And as you mentioned, his key idea here is the Leviathan is essentially a social contract in which people give up some liberty in exchange for a supreme authority who can provide them with security. I would say that Rome and many other states throughout history have done that to a certain extent. When we talk about criminal enterprises, in large part, they're protection rackets. They offer protection, sometimes from themselves, sometimes from neighbors, sometimes from evil spirits, in exchange for taxation, tribute, resources. Hence, I think the difference in this case is not that these were not Leviathan while the modern state is. I think these were all, at least in Hobbes's most basic sense, Leviathans of a sort. And indeed, I think both Leviathan and Goliath are artificial in a way. While Rome did concentrate power into a single individual, it really was more about the class. So we've spoken about these as organized criminal rackets, and I think this also helps to explain in large part patriarchy. When we look across different states throughout history, different Leviathans, if you will, some can be more inclusive and democratic than others. The Venetians had an elected doge, for instance. Rome had a republic, even if it was a veiled oligarchy of sorts. We have ancient Athens and its lottery-based system of democracy as well. The catch here is in all those cases, it tends to be free men, usually men of fighting age or older, and just men. Which makes sense, since when you look at mafias and criminal enterprises, that's basically the same deal as well. Those who violently establish the racket, also the ones who have a collective say in it. But in short, there's not really, I think, that big a difference in that kind of Hobbesian view between modern states and previous states. What we've really had is an addition of new services, public goods, and deeper democracy on top of that basic function of acting as a protection racket. And that is in large part not because of technological change, but because of shared struggle. So if we look, say, for instance, the Industrial Revolution, where lots of people say life got better, whenever you think of improvements in literacy rates, improvements in maternal mortality, infant mortality, eradication of diseases like smallpox, most people point to the graph starting to go upwards from the Industrial Revolution. This is a bit of an illusion and misnomer. In the core of England, things actually get worse. Human health drops, life expectancy drops, human height drops during the onset of the Industrial Revolution. It's not until you get both technological change, but then you also get shared struggle through things like suffragettes, unions, etc., that you start to see the rollout of sanitation, the expansion of the vote, and greater provisions for welfare democracies. So even if we think of the state as being a larger social contract, providing all these other things apart from security, it's something that seems to happen not because of Leviathan per se, but rather because of people in many ways fighting back against Leviathan. And apart from that, just as one last little bit to my rant, I'll add that Hobbes, I also don't want to be on too hard on because I think in many ways Hobbes is simply emblematic of a wider view here. The view that as soon as you don't have some kind of overarching authority, people immediately will turn to violence in a scramble for resources. And this is, of course, the view that we have of collapse in general. It's not just one of people turn to violence, but also there's mass panic and mass disorder. Interestingly, when you look at studies of how people behave during natural disasters, things like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, but also during terrorist attacks and mass bombing campaigns like the Blitz in the UK, we tend to find the opposite. People are pretty good at self-organizing. They're pretty altruistic. They're pretty compassionate. They're not perfect, but they actually behave pretty well, actually often even better than the states that preceded them during periods of natural disasters. I think this overarching view of we need Goliath, we need Leviathan, otherwise we end up with chaos, is not just due to fluid civilizations, but also even due to modern day evidence, a misnomer.
I want to say two things against Hobbes and then one in his favour. So when I said he wanted to create the political conditions for long-term thinking, I absolutely accept that what he meant by that was founded on an idea of property. And actually, I think the key thing that he wanted was for fathers to be able to leave their properties to their sons. It was a very narrow view. So we're not talking about sustainability. We're not talking about passing on knowledge or information to future generations. We are very much here within a modern, let's call it what it is, proto-capitalist framework for the idea of what it is to think about a future beyond our own lifetimes. Absolutely, I accept that. I also accept that not only did he not understand the archaeological evidence, but he was already thinking as an imperialist. He was involved in the colonization of Virginia. He sat on the board of the Virginia Company. He claimed to know what Native American life was like. He had absolutely no idea. It was a fantasy. All of those things against him are true. The thing that I think is not right is that he had a grim view. And I actually think he was not primarily interested in or trying to argue about what happens when authority is taken away. He'd seen what happens when rival claims to authority cause terrible human suffering through warfare. That was the thing that he wanted to prevent. And I think he wanted to create the conditions in which it was possible for people to resist, push back, argue without collapse. So the history to that point is at a certain point when rival claims to power start to get strong enough, the thing starts to shake and eventually it falls apart. What would it be to have a state that was sufficiently mechanical that it was possible within the framework of that state for human beings, with all of their vanity, as he put it, their desire for status? He recognized all of that. In fact, a lot of his writing is about you got to take humans as they are, and they are status-driven creatures. Vainglory is what he called it. None of us are the best judges of our own merits, and we all want other people to recognize us in the way we see ourselves. Given that kind of understanding of human nature, what would be the form of politics that made it possible for people like that, people like us, modern people who want luxury and property and other people to think that we're great, to have the sorts of arguments that to this point in human history have caused political structures to collapse? And by collapse, he meant the kind of war of all against all that consumed Europe in the first half of the 17th century. And I think he was probably right when he said there is a version of this which is more impersonal, more in a way mechanical, actually more bureaucratic in some ways, within which it will be possible to have these arguments without it descending into war. And in some ways, history has borne him out. The thing that you described, which is conditions do get better, not because of the Industrial Revolution, but because there is a politics that emerges that can accommodate people's desire for something better. I'm not saying Hobbes had the answer, but I think that's the thing that he wanted. So that's what he wanted. I don't think he was that bothered about quote unquote anarchy. It was just a thought experiment. The thing he wanted was Denmark.
And luckily, at least some of us have made it to Denmark.
But only on the back of these vast imperial criminal enterprises. I accept that completely too. including Denmark. Let's not let Denmark off the hook just because it didn't have a giant. It's still part of the European story here.
It's still worthwhile bearing in mind that this is fairly exceptional, that the progress we've had in the human condition under state life has been a very recent thing, only for a sliver of humanity over the last 2 centuries, basically. When you look at different indicators for human welfare, whether that's real wages or human height, for most of human history, they've more or less been stagnant. Human height, at least for men, has been roughly 170 centimeters with some fluctuation. Interestingly, people often grow taller after collapse, as we see in Rome, for instance. That's not just a matter of people having more resources because so many people die, so there's more left over for survivors. Even the case of Rome, those outside the empire were taller and healthier. Hence the old trope of the muscle-bound Germanic barbarian. To their Italian counterparts, they would have seemed quite large. Similarly, when you look at real wages, apart from a couple of exceptions like ancient Athens, in general, real wages are pretty much stagnant for most of human history. So when you think of welfare overall here, it's largely that in many ways, especially for human health, things get worse with the intensification of agriculture, and they more or less stay that way until you start to get both the Industrial Revolution, but as mentioned, importantly, these shared political and power struggles. I don't think this has so much to do with the machinery of government. It does to a certain extent, and I think states can work very, very well. And if we strip this of the kind of philosophical underpinnings of Hobbes, it becomes more of a question of what is it that makes states better at providing for the welfare of their citizens and less like the organized crime rackets of the past. And the biggest thing seems to be more or less ensuring that people have more collective power over the Leviathan machine.
A reminder that we have a new series of films coming up at the Regent Street Cinema in London over the next few months, and we'd love to see you there. You can get tickets by clicking on the link in the show description or going to the events page on our website, ppfideas.com. The films we have coming up are the South Park movie, Bigger, Longer and Uncut, The Third Man, Good Night and Good Luck, Never Let Me Go, and we're starting with Whit Stillman's Metropolitan. I will be in conversation with the writer and journalist James Marriott about what is his favourite film of all time. That's on the 19th of March. All tickets available now. We would love to see you there. Next time, I'm talking to Luke Kemp about Goliaths in the 21st century. What are the prospects for surviving societal collapse in 2026? And what are the things that might prevent it? This has been Past, Present, Future.